On his first morning at Halstead and Rowe Consulting, Daniel Reyes stood in front of the mirrored closet door of his tiny apartment and smoothed down the sleeves of the only blazer he owned. It was charcoal gray, slightly oversized at the shoulders and faintly shiny at the elbows where fabric had thinned with years of careful wear. The lining had been restitched twice by his mother's steady hands. The buttons didn't match perfectly. One had been replaced with a similar shade after the original crack during his final year of college. But the blazer was pressed with care, and Daniel wore it with quiet pride. He had ironed it at dawn. Outside, the city moved in its usual rush, trains rattling, car horns echoing between buildings, sunlight reflecting off towers of glass and steel. Somewhere in that skyline stood the headquarters of Halstead and Rowe, a firm whose name alone could open doors. To Daniel, it felt like the threshold to a different life. He had earned this internship through sleepless nights, scholarship applications, and weekends spent tutoring high school students to help with rent. He had graduated at the top of his class from a state university that rarely appeared on glossy recruitment brochures. While some of his peers had family connections and polished resumes built on private networks, Daniel had grit, spreadsheets, and relentless discipline. He believed that would be enough. When he stepped into the firm's lobby, he was momentarily swallowed by marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. A digital directory listed executive names in sleek lettering. Assistants moved briskly in tailored suits that seemed sculpted rather than sewn. Daniel adjusted the strap of his worn leather bag and approached the front desk with steady steps. By 9 o'clock, he had been introduced to the summer intern cohort, 6 young professionals who looked as though they had stepped out of a fashion editorial on corporate success. Their suits were slim-cut, their shoes gleaming. One wore a watch that could have covered a semester of Daniel's tuition. Another casually mentioned her family's annual ski trip in Switzerland. Daniel listened more than he spoke. The first glance at his jacket came from across the conference table. It was subtle at first, a raised eyebrow, a whisper hidden behind a manicured hand, then came the sideways smiles. By lunch, the whispers were no longer whispers. Someone pointed out that his blazer looked vintage. Another suggested it might be retro corporate chic. Laughter followed, thin and sharp. A comment drifted across the open workspace about how internships now came with thrift store sponsorships. Daniel kept his eyes on his laptop screen. He told himself it didn't matter. He reminded himself that he was here to learn, not to impress. But even the strongest resolve feels the weight of repeated glances and suppressed giggles. Each time someone passed his desk, he felt the silent assessment. It was not just about fabric or buttons, it was about belonging. In offices like this, belonging often wore a price tag. Over the next few days, the teasing settled into a rhythm. It wasn't loud enough to file a complaint, never explicit enough to be written down. It came disguised as humor, as corporate banter, as friendly advice. A senior associate suggested he upgrade before client-facing season. Another intern jokingly asked if the firm offered a clothing allowance for heritage pieces. Daniel smiled when required, he nodded politely, he thanked them for the suggestions. What they didn't see were the late nights he had spent building financial models for practice. They didn't see the meticulous notes he kept on industry reports, the extra case studies he reviewed before bed. They didn't see the careful budgeting spreadsheet on his phone that tracked every dollar down to subway fare. They saw the jacket. By the end of his first week, Daniel had quietly become the unofficial punchline of the intern group chat. A photo of him reaching for coffee had been cropped and zoomed in on the elbow patch. A caption about corporate archaeology followed, the thread filled with laughing emojis. Daniel found out when someone accidentally left their screen open near the printer. He stared at the image for a long moment. Then he walked back to his desk and finished his work ahead of schedule. At home that night, he carefully hung the blazer by the window to air out. His mother had called earlier to ask how the first week was going. He had told her it was wonderful. He described the glass offices and the big projects and how grateful he felt. He did not mention the laughter. She had sacrificed too much to hear that part. The following Monday, an email rippled through the office like electricity. The subject line was short but heavy: mandatory all-staff strategy session, executive board attendance required. The message stated that all departments, including interns, were expected to attend a special meeting later that week. The firm's founding partners and board members would be present. The agenda hinted at a major strategic shift, possibly even a restructuring. Excitement and anxiety intertwined in the air. For the interns, it was a rare opportunity. Most would never be in the same room as the board, let alone present during a high-level discussion. Conversations shifted from fashion to forecasting. The teasing subsided, replaced by rehearsed elevator pitches and frantic review of quarterly reports. Daniel read the email twice. He noticed something others didn't: a line requesting that all attendees review the firm's recent expansion proposal into underserved regional markets. It was a project that had quietly stalled over the past year. Daniel had stumbled upon the data during his onboarding research and had spent nights analyzing why the projections had been overly conservative. He had run alternative models, he had built simulations no one asked for. He had done it because numbers told stories, and he wanted to understand them. In the days leading up to the meeting, Daniel worked silently. While others discussed what tie to wear and which executive to impress, he refined his spreadsheets. He cross-checked demographic trends, he revisited risk assessments and recalculated margins under different scenarios. His blazer hung on the back of his chair as he worked, its fabric catching the late afternoon light. On the morning of the board meeting, the office transformed. Executives from satellite branches arrived in tailored suits. The conference hall was rearranged into a formal auditorium setup. Bottled water lined the tables in perfect symmetry. The interns gathered near the back, whispering about visibility and networking opportunities. One of them glanced at Daniel and smirked, asking if he was planning to wear the same lucky jacket for the big day. Daniel looked down at his sleeves. He thought of his mother's careful stitching. He thought of long nights and bus rides and scholarship essays. He thought of the promise he had made to himself that he would never be ashamed of where he started. He put the blazer on. As they filed into the grand conference hall, the board members took their seats at the front, faces known from framed portraits in the lobby. The room fell into expectant silence. Daniel chose a seat near the aisle, his laptop balanced on his knees. The meeting began with opening remarks about growth, challenges, and the need for innovation. Charts flashed on a massive screen. Terms like market volatility and strategic recalibration echoed through the hall. Then, halfway through the presentation, one of the senior partners paused. There was a slide on the screen, the stalled regional expansion plan. The partner frowned slightly, noting that despite strong potential, the proposal had failed to secure unanimous board support due to risk concerns. He asked if anyone had revisited the numbers recently. A quiet tension settled over the room. Executives glanced at one another. No one immediately responded. In the back row, Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of his laptop. The laughter about his jacket still lingered in the air of memory. But the numbers on his screen told a different story. As the senior partner scanned the room once more, inviting insight from anyone willing to offer it, Daniel slowly rose from his seat. And in that moment, every eye turned, not to his credentials, not to his resume, but to the intern in the worn charcoal blazer. The board meeting had only just begun. The room did not fall silent all at once. It shifted. At first, there was the soft rustling of papers, the faint hum of the projector, the distant tapping of someone's pen against polished wood. But when Daniel rose from his seat in the back row, an almost imperceptible wave of attention moved forward, row by row, until it reached the front of the hall. An intern standing during a board-level strategy session was not standard practice. A few eyebrows lifted, a few lips curved, anticipating awkwardness. Those who had spent the week whispering about his jacket assumed this would be another moment to privately roll their eyes. They expected nervous rambling, perhaps an overambitious suggestion quickly dismissed. They did not expect precision. Daniel's voice, though measured, carried clearly through the microphone handed to him by a passing coordinator. He did not introduce himself with exaggerated confidence. He simply stated his name and role, acknowledging that he had reviewed the regional expansion proposal in detail and had run alternative projections based on updated demographic and consumer behavior data. The senior partner at the podium leaned back slightly, signaling him to continue. On the large screen behind them, the slide remained frozen on conservative growth estimates and red-highlighted risk percentages. Daniel glanced at it once, then turned to his laptop. He requested permission to connect. There was a hesitation, brief but visible. Interns did not usually present during executive meetings, yet something in his composure lacked arrogance. It felt less like interruption and more like preparation. Permission was granted. Moments later, the screen flickered. The original slide disappeared, replaced by a clean dashboard of charts, trend lines, and layered projections. The formatting was simple but elegant, the data unmistakably thorough. Daniel began by outlining a flaw in the initial risk assessment model. The firm had relied heavily on outdated migration data and had underestimated mid-tier market purchasing power in 3 specific regions. He referenced publicly available census updates, cross-compared with internal client acquisition patterns over the last 18 months. The numbers shifted in real time. Where once there had been caution-colored graphs, there were now recalculated margins reflecting controlled but promising growth. He demonstrated how a phased rollout, starting with hybrid digital infrastructure rather than full physical expansion, would reduce upfront costs by nearly 30%. He did not rush. He did not overstate. He walked the board through each assumption, each variable adjustment, each scenario simulation. His projections included best-case and worst-case outcomes, sensitivity analyses, and contingency buffers. The murmurs that followed were no longer amused. They were attentive. Several board members leaned forward, elbows on the table. One asked about capital allocation under fluctuating interest rates. Daniel answered by toggling to another sheet already prepared. Another inquired about staffing scalability. He presented a tiered hearing strategy linked to revenue thresholds. Each question met with calm clarity. In the back rows, the interns who had once laughed found themselves staring at the same jacket they had mocked, now framed beneath the glow of a projection screen that illuminated data none of them had thought to examine. The senior partner who had initially questioned the stalled proposal now requested a copy of Daniel's model. The meeting, originally scheduled as a review, transformed into an impromptu strategy workshop. Executives began debating implementation timelines based on Daniel's recalibrated projections. The tone shifted from skepticism to possibility. Terms like viable, sustainable, and strategically advantageous replaced earlier caution. Daniel stood for nearly 20 minutes. Not once did he mention the hours he had spent building those models after midnight. Not once did he reveal that he had printed drafts at a campus library because ink cartridges were expensive. He let the numbers speak. When he finally returned to his seat, the silence that followed felt different from the one that had greeted him at the start. It was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of reconsideration. The board concluded the session with a decision to reconvene in 48 hours, allowing senior analysts to validate Daniel's revised projections. The regional expansion plan, once considered too risky, was now officially under renewed review. As people began filing out, conversations buzzed with unfamiliar energy. A managing director approached Daniel first. He asked where he had learned to structure scenario analyses that way. Daniel credited his university coursework and independent research. Another executive inquired about his background. A third mentioned that the firm had been seeking fresh analytical perspectives for months. Each interaction was professional, respectful. Across the room, the interns stood clustered together. Their earlier confidence felt thinner now. One avoided eye contact entirely. Another attempted a congratulatory nod that seemed forced. The group chat that had once carried jokes about elbow patches remained quiet. By late afternoon, Daniel received an email from the senior partner who had paused the presentation. The message was brief but significant. It thanked him for his initiative and requested a one-on-one meeting the following morning to discuss his model in greater depth. The subject line read, "Impressive work." Daniel stared at it longer than he expected. Back at his desk, the same open workspace that had felt so exposed during his first week now seemed transformed. It was not the furniture that had changed, nor the lighting, nor the dress code. It was perception. Yet perception, Daniel knew, was fragile. He returned to his tasks without outward celebration. He responded to emails. He adjusted minor formulas in his spreadsheet after rechecking assumptions. He remained the same intern who had walked in days earlier, except now, whispers followed him for a different reason. Not all reactions were admiration. In corners of the office, subtle discomfort brewed. Some senior associates who had overlooked the regional proposal months earlier felt a sting to their professional pride. It was easier to laugh at an intern's jacket than to admit missing an opportunity hidden in plain sight. One associate remarked that perhaps Daniel had simply gotten lucky with timing. Another suggested that fresh eyes sometimes stumble onto what seasoned analysts deem impractical. These comments floated just loud enough to be heard, yet soft enough to avoid accountability. Daniel heard them. He did not respond. The following morning, he entered the senior partner's office, a space lined with bookshelves and framed accolades. The partner asked detailed questions about Daniel's assumptions, testing the resilience of his logic. Daniel answered each with data-backed reasoning. When challenged, he did not grow defensive, he refined. By the end of the meeting, the partner extended an unexpected offer. Daniel would temporarily assist the strategy team in stress testing the revised expansion plan. It was not a promotion, it was not a title change. But it was access. Word of the assignment traveled quickly. The interns who had once measured status in brands and tailoring now watched as Daniel attended closed-door meetings. The same blazer accompanied him each day, no longer a punchline but a quiet constant. The firm's senior analysts began validating his projections and the results aligned. Adjustments were made, but the core thesis held strong. The expansion plan moved from tentative to actionable. 48 hours later, the board reconvened. This time, Daniel did not sit in the back. He was invited to the side table reserved for contributing analysts. As the meeting progressed, the chairperson announced that the regional expansion initiative would proceed under a phased rollout model, closely mirroring the framework Daniel had proposed. Applause filled the room. Not thunderous, not theatrical, but sincere. And as the meeting concluded, something subtle yet powerful settled over the company, a recalibration of value. It was no longer about who wore the sharpest suit. It was about who saw what others missed. Yet beneath the recognition, a deeper truth waited to surface, one that would challenge not only perceptions of an intern but the culture of the firm itself. Because while Daniel's numbers had shifted strategy, they were about to expose something far more personal. And the next revelation would not come from a spreadsheet. Success changes the volume of a room. After the board approved the regional expansion framework, Halstead and Rowe felt different. The same marble floors reflected the same filtered sunlight, the same executives moved between meetings, but conversations carried a new undercurrent. Daniel Reyes was no longer invisible. Emails now included him in threads once restricted to senior analysts. His calendar, once sparse and colorless, filled with strategy sessions and review calls. Colleagues who had never learned his last name now greeted him with professional warmth. But recognition, Daniel discovered, does not erase memory. The laughter still echoed faintly in his mind whenever he passed the break room. The cropped photo from the group chat lingered like a watermark behind every congratulatory nod. Respect had arrived quickly, but it felt reactive, not reflective. What unsettled him most was not the praise, it was how easily it had replaced mockery. In the days that followed the board's decision, the firm's leadership team conducted internal reviews to ensure the expansion plan was both ethically and operationally sound. Daniel's projections had opened a door, now the company needed to walk through it responsibly. During one late evening session, Daniel remained in the strategy room long after others had left. The city skyline glowed beyond the windows. Files were spread across the table: market analysis, regional income data, client segmentation charts. As he cross-checked numbers against historical performance reports, something subtle caught his attention. The original version of the stalled proposal, submitted nearly a year earlier, contained a promising early framework. It had been prepared by a mid-level analyst named Harold Whitman. Daniel recognized the name. Harold occupied a modest desk 2 rows away from the interns. He was quiet, meticulous, and rarely engaged in office banter. His suits were always clean but noticeably outdated in cut and style. His shoes, polished yet worn, told stories of careful maintenance rather than frequent replacement. Daniel remembered overhearing jokes about Harold's retro wardrobe months before his own jacket became entertainment. He reopened the archive proposal. Harold's initial projections had in fact hinted at the very demographic shifts Daniel later expanded upon. The difference lay not in insight but in reception. Harold's report had been dismissed quickly, labeled overly optimistic without substantial follow-up analysis. Daniel compared timestamps. The rejection email had been sent the same week Harold's wife underwent surgery for a chronic illness. Publicly, Harold had requested flexible hours during that period. Privately, he had been managing hospital bills and caregiving responsibilities. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. The numbers told 2 stories now. One was about market expansion. The other was about overlooked voices. The next morning, Daniel requested access to older performance reviews and internal feedback logs related to the regional project. What he found confirmed a pattern, not malicious, not explicit, but persistent. Ideas from certain employees tended to receive less traction unless validated by higher-profile teams. Presentation polish often outweighed analytical depth. Confidence, especially the kind packaged in tailored confidence, traveled farther than quiet competence. Daniel saw himself in the margins of those documents. And he saw Harold. That afternoon, as the firm prepared for a public announcement regarding the expansion initiative, Daniel made a quiet decision. When the communications team asked him to provide a brief summary for internal distribution, he included a paragraph acknowledging that the revised strategy had been built upon earlier foundational work by Harold Whitman. He did not dramatize it. He simply stated that strong ideas often evolve through collaborative refinement and that the firm benefited from the groundwork laid months prior. The internal memo was sent company-wide. Harold read it from his modest desk. For several minutes he did not move. In boardrooms and executive offices, acknowledgement may seem procedural, but for someone whose contributions have quietly dissolved into background noise, being seen can feel seismic. The following day, the senior partner publicly recognized Harold during a department meeting. He praised the persistence behind the original concept and admitted that the firm could have engaged more thoroughly with the data earlier. The room shifted again. It was subtle but meaningful. Daniel watched as Harold stood, visibly uncomfortable with attention yet dignified. Applause followed, not forced, not exuberant, but sincere. For the first time since joining the company, Daniel felt something settle inside him. Justice, he realized, is not always loud. Sometimes it is a correction of direction. However, cultural habits do not disappear overnight. While leadership began discussing initiatives around merit-based evaluation and anonymous proposal reviews, tensions simmered among a few who felt threatened by the narrative shift. If overlooked ideas were now under scrutiny, so too were past dismissals. One senior associate in particular struggled with the recalibration. He had been among the loudest voices labeling the regional expansion as unrealistic. He had also been one of the first to joke about Daniel's jacket. Whispers returned, but this time they carried uncertainty rather than ridicule. Meanwhile, the expansion plan moved forward. Pilot programs launched in 2 target regions. Early performance indicators exceeded even Daniel's conservative projections. Media coverage highlighted the firm's forward-thinking strategy. Externally, Halstead and Rowe appeared visionary. Internally, a deeper evaluation was unfolding. The executive board initiated a confidential climate assessment, surveying employees across departments about workplace culture, inclusivity, and idea recognition. The results revealed patterns consistent with what Daniel had quietly uncovered, subtle biases linked not to capability, but to presentation, pedigree, and perception. The findings were not catastrophic, but they were undeniable. At the next all-hands meeting, the chairperson addressed the staff with measured honesty. The firm, he explained, had grown rapidly. Growth sometimes obscured blind spots. The board was committed to recalibrating not only strategy but values. Policies would be updated, proposal reviews would be anonymized in early stages, mentorship programs would pair interns and analysts across hierarchical lines. Daniel listened from his seat, not in the back anymore but not at the front either. He did not seek a spotlight. He sought alignment. After the meeting, several interns approached him. Their congratulations felt less performative now. One admitted that the early teasing had been immature. Another expressed regret in vague terms. None offered a direct apology, but the tone had shifted from superiority to reflection. Daniel understood something important in that moment. Growth, like strategy, requires confrontation with discomfort. That evening, he returned home to his small apartment. He removed the blazer carefully, placing it over the chair by his desk. The fabric, though worn, seemed heavier with meaning now. It had been present when he was underestimated. It had been present when he was recognized. But the jacket was never the story. The story was what people chose to see or ignore. As the internship approached its midpoint, rumors began circulating about full-time offers. Traditionally, only one intern secured a permanent analyst position each cycle. Competition intensified quietly, resumes were updated, networking efforts multiplied. Daniel continued his work, focused not on offers but on impact. Then, one Friday afternoon, an unexpected calendar invite appeared in his inbox. Executive Board private session. No agenda listed. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Daniel stared at the subject line, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear but anticipation. The board meeting that had changed his trajectory was only the beginning. Now something larger was unfolding. And whatever waited behind that closed-door session would determine not just his future, but the future culture of Halstead and Rowe itself. The next chapter would not be about projections. It would be about accountability. Monday morning arrived with a quiet gravity. The city outside moved as it always did, subways screeching along rails, commuters clutching coffee cups, sunlight glinting against mirrored towers. But inside Halstead and Rowe, the air carried something weightier. Daniel felt it as he stepped into the elevator, the worn leather strap of his bag resting against his shoulder. He wore the same charcoal blazer. Not because he lacked alternatives, but because it had become a reminder of beginnings, of perception, of the thin line between being overlooked and being heard. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere shifted from open workspace energy to deliberate stillness. The hallway was quieter, the carpet thicker, the walls lined with framed milestones of the firm's growth over decades. Daniel walked toward the boardroom. He did not know what waited inside, but he understood that this moment was not just about performance, it was about direction. The board members were already seated when he entered. Their expressions were composed, not stern but serious. The senior partner who had first invited him to present nodded for him to sit at the center table. There were no projection screens this time, no slides. Just conversation. The chairperson began by acknowledging the measurable success of the regional expansion's initial rollout. Early results had exceeded projections. Client acquisition was steady. Risk exposure remained within sustainable thresholds. The firm's public reputation had strengthened. Daniel listened quietly. Then the tone shifted. The chairperson explained that while financial growth mattered, the board had spent the past week reviewing the internal climate assessment. The findings revealed a pattern that leadership could no longer ignore, subtle biases influencing whose ideas were amplified and whose were quietly sidelined. They spoke of perception-based valuation, of how pedigree, appearance, and presentation sometimes overshadowed substance, of how growth had unintentionally nurtured hierarchy over humility. Daniel recognized the unspoken connection. The chairperson then said something that settled deeply into the room: strategy without integrity is temporary. The firm, they explained, did not merely want to expand into new markets, it wanted to recalibrate its culture. To ensure that innovation could rise from any desk, that respect was not conditional on tailoring. Then came the unexpected turn. The board was establishing a new initiative, an internal program focused on inclusive innovation and merit-based evaluation reform. It would oversee anonymized proposal pipelines, cross-level mentorships, and data-driven performance reviews. They wanted Daniel to help design it. Not as a token gesture, not as a symbolic intern success story, but as someone who had experienced both ends of perception within the same walls. Daniel felt the weight of that request. He understood what it meant. To participate would be to step into a role larger than spreadsheets. It would require navigating sensitivities, challenging long-held habits, and collaborating with those who might feel exposed by change. The board made one more thing clear. Regardless of his decision, they were offering him a full-time analyst position upon graduation. The offer was formal, written, guaranteed. In many ways, it was the culmination of everything he had worked toward. But Daniel did not answer immediately. He thought of his mother's careful stitches along the inside lining of his blazer, of Harold's quiet resilience, of the interns who had laughed not out of cruelty alone but out of unexamined comfort, of how easily environments reward polish over persistence. He realized that what had happened to him was not rare. It was common. The boardroom fell silent as they waited. Daniel finally spoke, not with dramatic flourish but with grounded clarity. He expressed gratitude for the opportunity. He acknowledged the faith they were placing in him, and he agreed to both the analyst position and the cultural initiative on one condition: that the program not center on him. It must center on systems. He explained that individual stories can inspire but structures sustain. If the firm truly wanted change, it had to commit to measurable accountability, clear metrics, transparent reporting, and leadership participation. The board members exchanged glances. Then they nodded. In that moment, the intern who had once been reduced to a jacket was no longer navigating perception. He was shaping policy. Over the following months, the Inclusive Innovation Initiative took form. Proposal submissions were anonymized in early review stages. Data dashboards tracked idea progression without revealing titles or tenure. Senior leaders participated in reverse mentorship sessions, listening rather than instructing. Harold became one of the first mentors in the program, paired with a junior associate known more for presentation flair than analytical depth. Their collaboration produced one of the firm's most balanced strategic models to date. The atmosphere within Halstead and Rowe did not transform overnight, but it shifted steadily. Conversations became more intentional, recognition broadened, humor softened. And Daniel's blazer remained part of his daily routine. Not because he could not afford another, but because he chose not to forget. One afternoon, months later, a new intern walked into the office wearing an ill-fitted suit that bore the unmistakable signs of careful reuse. A faint hesitation marked his posture as he stepped into the open workspace. Daniel noticed immediately. He also noticed the quick glances from others, familiar, instinctive. Before whispers could take shape, Daniel walked over and welcomed the intern personally. He introduced him to colleagues, invited him to join a project meeting, and ensured that the first impression offered was not judgment, but inclusion. The ripple effect was subtle but powerful. People followed example more readily than policy. By the end of the fiscal year, the Regional Expansion Initiative had become one of the firm's strongest growth pillars. Industry publications praised Halstead and Rowe not only for strategic foresight but for progressive internal reforms. At the annual company gathering, the chairperson delivered a speech about vision and values. He spoke of markets conquered and metrics exceeded, but he closed with something simpler. He said that the true strength of a company lies not in its branding, but in its willingness to see beyond it. As applause filled the room, Daniel stood among his colleagues, no longer separated by intern status, no longer defined by perception. He thought back to the day he had first risen from the back row. The laughter, the doubt, the weight of eyes measuring fabric instead of focus. What changed the room was not a dramatic confrontation. It was competence. And what changed the culture was not humiliation. It was accountability. Daniel understood then that karma in the modern world rarely arrives as spectacle. It arrives as exposure, as truth surfacing where assumption once stood. The coworkers who had teased him were still there. Some had grown, some had apologized in quiet ways, others simply adapted. But the lesson remained, stitched as firmly as the lining inside his blazer. Never measure potential by appearance. Because the board meeting always begins eventually. And when it does, only substance speaks. The story of the intern's outfit faded into company lore not as a tale of embarrassment but as a reminder. A reminder that dignity does not depend on designer labels, that justice can unfold without cruelty, that real success is not about being seen first, but about being ready when you finally are. And somewhere in a modest apartment across the city, a mother listened proudly as her son described not just his promotion, but the culture he helped rebuild. The jacket still hung by the window, not as proof of struggle, but as proof that worth was never woven into fabric. It was always woven into character.